The sea looked calm that morning. Gentle waves rolled beneath the black hulls of hundreds of Greek ships, reflecting the pale light of a waking sun. To anyone standing on the shore, it might have seemed as though the greatest war of the ancient world had finally reached its peaceful ending. The city of Troy had fallen. The fires that had burned through its streets were fading into drifting columns of smoke. Warriors who had spent 10 long years sleeping on hard ground, fighting beneath foreign walls, and wondering if they would ever see their homes again were finally preparing to leave. Among them stood one man whose journey was only just beginning. His name was Odysseus, king of the small rocky island of Ithaca. Unlike the greatest warriors of his age, he was not remembered first for his strength or the size of his army. He was remembered for something quieter and perhaps more dangerous. He was a man who solved impossible problems with patience, careful words, and an imagination that could see paths where others saw only walls. The famous wooden horse that brought Troy to its end was said by many ancient storytellers to have been his idea. It was a victory built not on brute force, but on understanding how people think. Yet the strangest truth of all was this. The man clever enough to help end a decade-long war would spend another 10 years trying to return to a home that lay only across the sea. His enemies would not all be human. His greatest battles would not always be fought with swords. Storms, monsters, gods, temptation, loneliness, grief, and hope would become his companions. Some dangers would roar from dark caves. Others would whisper gently, inviting him to forget everything he had once loved. Tonight, we follow that extraordinary journey. Not as a list of adventures, but as the slow unfolding of one of humanity's oldest and most enduring stories. If you enjoy these quiet walks through history, myth, and the ancient world, consider subscribing if these stories bring you a little peace. And if you feel like sharing, let us know where you're listening from and what time the night has reached where you are. It is always comforting to imagine listeners across different countries settling into the same story beneath different skies. Now, allow yourself to become comfortable. Let the room grow still around you. Let the sounds of the day slowly drift away. Together, we are traveling back nearly 3,000 years, to a world where gods were believed to walk beside mortals, where every mountain carried a legend, every island hid a mystery, and every voyage across the sea was a journey into the unknown. To understand Odysseus, we first need to understand the world that shaped him. The Mediterranean of the Late Bronze Age was not simply a collection of scattered islands surrounded by blue water. It was a network of kingdoms connected by trade, diplomacy, marriage, and sometimes war. Ships carried olive oil, bronze weapons, wine, pottery, timber, precious metals, and stories. Sailors moved between distant ports where languages mixed with the smell of salt air and burning incense. Kings ruled from fortified palaces decorated with colorful frescoes. Messengers carried sealed tablets written in scripts that many people today have never even heard of. This was a world balanced delicately between prosperity and uncertainty. Storms could destroy fleets. Earthquakes could level cities in moments. Pirates haunted the sea lanes. Harvests depended upon weather that no ruler could command. Across the region, every kingdom understood that survival depended not only upon military strength, but upon cooperation, reputation, and careful alliances. Among these kingdoms stood Mycenaean Greece, a collection of powerful palace states ruled by warrior kings. Each kingdom had its own ruler, its own ambitions, and often its own rivalries. Yet when the call came to sail against Troy, many of these rulers united beneath a common cause. Whether every detail of the Trojan War happened exactly as later poets described remains one of history's great mysteries. Archaeology has shown that a wealthy city stood where ancient Troy once rose, overlooking the narrow waters of the Dardanelles. The city was destroyed more than once across its long history. Historians continue to debate how much of Homer's tale reflects real events and how much belongs to centuries of storytelling. But regardless of where history ends and legend begins, the story became one of the foundations of Western literature. The war itself was said to have begun because of a single woman. Helen, celebrated as the most beautiful woman in the world, left, or according to some traditions, was taken, from her husband Menelaus, king of Sparta, and traveled to Troy with Prince Paris. What followed was far more than a personal dispute. Oaths sworn years before bound many Greek kings to defend Helen's marriage. Those promises pulled kingdoms into conflict. And so thousands of ships crossed the sea. For 10 exhausting years the Greeks surrounded Troy. Battles were fought beneath towering walls. Great heroes earned immortal reputations. Others disappeared into forgotten graves far from home. Children grew into adults without fathers. Entire generations knew nothing except the endless rhythm of war. Odysseus was one among many leaders, yet he quickly earned a different kind of respect. Ancient storytellers rarely describe him as the strongest warrior. That honor usually belonged to Achilles. Nor was he always the most admired. Instead, Odysseus possessed what the Greeks called métis, a quality difficult to translate into a single English word. It meant intelligence. But not ordinary intelligence. It meant practical wisdom. Flexibility. The ability to think several moves ahead. Knowing when to speak and when to remain silent. Finding victory through understanding rather than force. This quality would become both his greatest strength and, at times, his greatest weakness. Because intelligence can easily become pride. And pride, in Greek mythology, almost always carries consequences. When Troy finally fell through the deception of the wooden horse, celebration spread across the Greek camp. Warriors believed the hardest years were behind them. Families waited across the sea. Wives had spent a decade wondering whether their husbands still lived. Children barely remembered the fathers who had sailed away before they could walk. Among those waiting was Penelope, Queen of Ithaca. Faithful, patient, and remarkably intelligent in her own right. When Odysseus left for Troy, their son Telemachus was still an infant. The little boy would grow into adulthood knowing his father only through stories told by others. For Odysseus, returning home was never simply about reclaiming a throne. It meant returning to a family suspended in time. But history, and myth, rarely allows easy endings. As the Greek fleet prepared to sail, old rivalries among the gods had not disappeared simply because the war had ended. According to the ancient poets, the Olympian gods watched human affairs closely. They argued, favored different heroes, punished insults, and rewarded devotion. To the people who first heard these stories, storms were not merely weather. They could be expressions of divine anger. Unexpected fortune might be the smile of a goddess. Disaster could arrive because of a forgotten sacrifice or a careless boast. Among the gods, one would become Odysseus' greatest enemy. Poseidon, Lord of the sea. His domain stretched across every wave the Greek ships would need to cross. At first, however, Odysseus knew nothing of the trials ahead. He sailed with confidence. The coastline of Troy slowly disappeared behind the horizon. Fresh winds filled the sails. Bronze helmets caught the sunlight. Oars dipped rhythmically into the water as island after island emerged from the blue distance. For a short while, it seemed as though the journey home would be simple. But ancient stories often hide their greatest dangers behind moments of calm. The first landfall came at Ismarus, home of the Sicyones. The Greeks attacked the coastal city, capturing supplies and treasure. In the traditions of ancient warfare, victories like this were not unusual. Yet Odysseus urged his men to leave quickly. He understood something many of them did not. Success often creates overconfidence. His crew ignored him. Instead of departing, they lingered. Food was gathered. Wine flowed freely. The excitement of surviving Troy encouraged celebration. Warriors who had endured years of hardship believed they deserved rest. Meanwhile, survivors escaped inland. There they called for help. Fresh warriors soon arrived from neighboring settlements, better prepared, more numerous, and determined to defend their homeland. As dawn broke, the Greeks suddenly found themselves facing an organized counterattack. The battle turned against them. Many of Odysseus' companions fell on the beaches where only hours earlier they had celebrated. The ships escaped. But not without terrible losses. It was a painful lesson, and only the beginning. Sometimes the greatest dangers do not come from monsters or curses. Sometimes they begin with failing to leave when wisdom quietly tells us it is time. The fleet pushed onward, battered by grief and uncertainty. The open sea stretched endlessly ahead, beautiful yet unforgiving. Ancient sailors possessed no modern maps, no compasses, no reliable forecasts. They navigated by stars, coastlines, winds, and experience. Every voyage demanded trust in both skill and fortune. Then the weather changed. Dark clouds gathered with surprising speed. Winds howled across the water, scattering ships and swallowing familiar landmarks. Rain lashed the sails. Waves crashed over wooden decks as exhausted sailors struggled simply to stay alive. For days they drifted wherever the storm carried them. When the skies finally cleared, nothing looked familiar. The world itself seemed different. Unknown shores appeared ahead. The long road home had quietly become something else entirely. Not merely a voyage across the sea, but a journey into lands where ordinary rules no longer seemed to apply. And on one of those distant shores, beneath the shade of strange trees heavy with unfamiliar fruit, Odysseus and his companions would soon meet people who offered no swords, no armies, and no obvious threat. Instead, they offered something far more dangerous. The chance to forget home altogether. And that simple invitation would reveal that not every enemy waits behind a fortress wall. Some wait quietly inside the human heart itself. The island seemed peaceful from the sea. Its shoreline was gentle, lined with pale sand that curved around quiet bays where the waves rolled in with barely a whisper. Beyond the beach, green hills rose beneath a warm sky, and trees swayed softly in the breeze. After the violence at Ismarus and the relentless storms that had driven the fleet far from familiar waters, the place almost looked like a gift. It carried none of the signs of danger that weary sailors had learned to fear. There were no towering walls, no watchtowers, no armies gathering along the coast. Sometimes, however, the most dangerous places are the ones that ask nothing of us except that we stay. Odysseus ordered the ships to anchor offshore while he chose a small group of trusted companions to explore the island. It was a careful decision. Throughout his life, he rarely rushed blindly into the unknown. Curiosity guided him, but caution walked beside it. Every new land could offer food, fresh water, or friendly allies. It could just as easily hide enemies beyond imagination. As the small party walked inland, they soon encountered the island's inhabitants. These people would later become known as the Lotus-Eaters. The ancient poet Homer tells us very little about who they were politically or where exactly they lived. Their land has never been identified with certainty. Historians and classicists have suggested different locations along the North African coast, while others believe the place belongs entirely to myth, representing not a point on a map but a state of mind. Perhaps that uncertainty is exactly the point. The Lotus-Eaters welcomed the strangers without fear. They did not attack. They did not threaten. They offered hospitality, something deeply respected throughout the ancient Mediterranean. Guests were often protected by sacred customs. Sharing food with a traveler was considered an honorable act. The food they offered was unlike anything Odysseus' men had tasted before. It came from the lotus plant. In Homer's telling, anyone who ate the lotus immediately lost the desire to return home. Memories did not vanish completely, but they no longer carried any urgency. Thoughts of wives, children, aging parents, and distant islands slowly drifted away like mist over the sea. The only thing that mattered was remaining where they were. To modern readers, this may sound like magic. Yet many scholars believe the lotus symbolizes something more universal. Across every age, human beings have encountered comforts that slowly weaken ambition, responsibility, and purpose. Whether through pleasure, distraction, or forgetfulness, people can become content to remain exactly where they are, even when their deepest hopes lie somewhere else. The lotus was not simply a fruit. It was temptation given a gentle face. Odysseus soon realized that several of his companions were refusing to return to the ships. They laughed peacefully among the islanders, speaking dreamily of staying forever. Home no longer seemed important. Ithaca had become little more than a fading memory. For a leader, moments like these are among the most difficult. How do you guide people who no longer wish to follow? Odysseus made a painful decision. He did not argue. He did not try to persuade them with long speeches. Instead, Homer tells us that he physically dragged the enchanted sailors back to the ships, binding them beneath the rowing benches until the fleet had sailed safely away from the island. It sounds harsh. Yet in the logic of the story, it was an act of compassion. Sometimes people must be rescued from choices they cannot clearly understand. As the coastline disappeared into the distance, the spell gradually loosened its grip. The men slowly remembered who they were, where they belonged, and why they had crossed so much of the world. But this strange encounter left behind an important lesson. Not every obstacle announces itself with violence. Some dangers arrive quietly, offering peace before asking us to abandon ourselves. And this was only the beginning. Far greater trials waited beyond the horizon. The fleet sailed onward through open waters where the rhythm of the oars became almost hypnotic. Day after day the sea stretched endlessly in every direction. At night the stars reflected upon the waves so perfectly that sailors sometimes felt they were floating between two heavens. For ancient mariners, the sea inspired both wonder and fear. The Mediterranean could appear calm enough to mirror the sky one hour and become a place of roaring winds the next. Navigation depended upon observation and memory. Every coastline carried stories. Every distant island might shelter friends, or creatures no one had imagined. Eventually another land appeared. Unlike the island of the Lotus-Eaters, this place looked rugged and wild. High cliffs rose sharply from the sea. Dark caves opened in the rocky hillsides. Thick forests covered the interior, while goats wandered freely across the landscape. Odysseus observed something curious. There were no cultivated fields. No organized ports. No visible towns. No ships resting in harbors. It seemed strangely untouched by civilization. The Greeks anchored in a sheltered bay where fresh water flowed from nearby springs. They hunted wild goats, built fires, and rested after the long voyage. For a brief time, life felt almost peaceful again. But Odysseus could not ignore his curiosity. Across a narrow stretch of water lay another island, larger than the one where his fleet had landed. Smoke could be seen rising in the distance. Someone lived there. Taking one ship and a carefully selected group of companions, Odysseus crossed the channel to investigate. That decision would become one of the most famous moments in all of Greek mythology. The explorers climbed through rocky hills until they discovered an enormous cave. At first glance it seemed abandoned. Inside stood huge baskets overflowing with cheese. Shelves held large containers of milk. Pens nearby sheltered sheep and goats unlike any the Greeks had ever seen. Everything suggested that whoever owned this place possessed extraordinary wealth. Some of Odysseus' men urged immediate departure. They suggested taking the food and escaping before the owner returned. It was sensible advice. They already had enough supplies. There was no reason to remain. But Odysseus wanted to meet the cave's master. Perhaps he hoped to receive gifts according to the sacred customs of hospitality. Perhaps simple curiosity overcame caution. Whatever his reasons, he chose to wait. History often turns upon choices that seem insignificant in the moment. Even brilliant people make decisions whose consequences they cannot yet imagine. As evening approached, the ground itself began to tremble. Heavy footsteps echoed outside. Then came the sound of hundreds of sheep entering the cave. Behind them walked a giant. He was the Cyclops Polyphemus, son of Poseidon. Unlike later artistic depictions that sometimes portray Cyclopes as skilled blacksmiths, Homer describes Polyphemus as a solitary shepherd. He lived apart from laws, cities, and assemblies. He answered to no king and recognized no customs except his own. Most striking of all, he possessed a single enormous eye in the center of his forehead. With effortless strength, Polyphemus rolled an immense stone across the entrance of the cave. The boulder was so massive that dozens of ordinary men could not have moved it. The Greeks were trapped. At first Odysseus stepped forward respectfully. He explained that they were travelers returning from Troy. He appealed to the sacred law of hospitality. Among civilized Greeks, strangers were often protected by Zeus himself under the title Zeus Xenios, guardian of guests. Polyphemus laughed. He cared nothing for Greek customs. He mocked their beliefs. Then, without warning, he reached down, seized two of Odysseus' companions, and killed them before the horrified survivors. The cave echoed with terror. The monster devoured them as though they were no different from animals. The remaining Greeks stood frozen. There could be no battle. Even if they somehow killed the giant while he slept, the enormous stone sealing the entrance would keep them imprisoned forever. Odysseus understood this immediately. Once again, survival would require intelligence rather than strength. That realization changed everything. The escape from the Cyclops would become one of the greatest demonstrations of cunning in all of ancient literature. But it would also contain the single mistake that condemned Odysseus to years of suffering still to come. Because escaping danger is one thing. Walking away from it without pride is something else. And before this encounter ended, one moment of triumph would awaken the anger of a god whose power reached across every sea the weary king still had to cross. Night settled slowly over the island. Outside the cave, the wind moved through the rocky hills with a low, steady whisper. The sheep huddled together after their long day of grazing, and the last traces of daylight disappeared beyond the western sea. Inside, however, there was no peace. The cave had become a prison, and every man trapped within it understood how fragile his life had suddenly become. Polyphemus, the giant Cyclops, seemed almost untouched by the horror he had caused. After his brutal meal, he stretched himself across the stone floor and soon fell into a deep sleep. His heavy breathing echoed through the cave like distant thunder, while the smell of smoke, sheep's wool, and fresh milk filled the cool night air. The Greeks gathered quietly in the shadows. Fear was everywhere. Some men whispered desperate ideas. Others sat in silence, unable to take their eyes off the enormous figure sleeping only a short distance away. Odysseus remained calm. That did not mean he was unafraid. One of the remarkable qualities that Homer gives his hero is not the absence of fear, but the ability to think while afraid. Courage, in this story, is not recklessness. It is clear thinking in moments when panic would be much easier. His first instinct was simple. Kill the monster while he slept. The opportunity seemed perfect. A sharpened spear driven into the giant's single eye, or even his heart, might end the nightmare before dawn. But almost immediately, Odysseus recognized the flaw. Even if Polyphemus died, the massive stone sealing the entrance would remain exactly where it was. None of the trapped Greeks possessed the strength to move it. They would escape the monster only to die inside his cave. So Odysseus waited. Sometimes the hardest decision is refusing to act too quickly. Morning arrived with cruel predictability. Polyphemus awoke, rekindled his fire, milked his sheep, and once again seized two more of Odysseus' companions. Their cries echoed briefly through the cave before falling silent forever. The giant then rolled the stone aside just enough to drive his flock out to pasture before sealing the entrance once again. Hope disappeared with the daylight. For men had already died. The others knew that unless something changed, tomorrow would simply repeat today. Yet as Odysseus looked around the cave, his eyes settled upon something leaning against the wall. It was a great wooden staff belonging to the Cyclops. To the giant it was merely a walking stick. To an ordinary man, it looked more like the trunk of a young tree. An idea began to form. Odysseus and his companions quietly cut a section from the enormous staff and sharpened one end into a long point. They hardened the wood in the fire, then carefully hid it beneath piles of animal dung so Polyphemus would notice nothing unusual. The weapon was ready. Only the right moment remained. As evening approached, the giant returned once more with his flock. Again the entrance was sealed. Again the terrible meal was repeated. The Greeks could only watch in helpless silence. Then Odysseus stepped forward carrying a skin filled with exceptionally strong wine. This wine had been given to him earlier in his travels by Marin, a priest of Apollo, after Odysseus had shown mercy during the raid at Ismarus. It was said to be so rich and powerful that it was normally mixed with many parts water before anyone dared drink it. Polyphemus had never tasted anything like it. The giant drank deeply. Then asked for more. Ancient Greek culture placed enormous value on wine, but drinking it undiluted was often viewed as uncivilized. Polyphemus, however, emptied the cup eagerly again and again until the alcohol began clouding his thoughts. Pleased by the unexpected gift, he laughed. "You have brought me excellent wine," he said in Homer's telling. "Tell me your name. I will give you a guest gift." It was a strange promise from a creature who had just eaten several of his guests. Odysseus answered carefully. "My name is Nobody." In Greek, the word was Oudys. It was more than a clever joke. It was another piece of the plan. The drunken Cyclops smiled. "Then Nobody," he replied, "I shall eat you last." A terrible promise. Yet under the circumstances, it was the closest thing to mercy the giant could imagine. Moments later, overcome by wine, Polyphemus collapsed into a heavy sleep. Odysseus acted immediately. He signaled to the remaining men. Together they lifted the sharpened stake. Even for several grown warriors, the heavy timber required tremendous effort. They heated its point until it glowed red. Then, gathering every ounce of strength they possessed, they drove it into the Cyclops' single eye. Homer compares the sound to that of a blacksmith plunging glowing iron into cold water. The cave exploded with terrible cries. Polyphemus leaped to his feet in agony, tearing the stake from his ruined eye. Blood and smoke filled the air as the blinded giant stumbled wildly through the darkness. He shouted for help. Other Cyclopes living among the nearby hills heard his cries and came running. Standing outside the sealed cave, they called to him. "What is wrong, Polyphemus? Who is hurting you?" The giant answered exactly as Odysseus had hoped. "Nobody is attacking me." The other Cyclopes fell silent. If nobody was attacking him, they assumed the pain must have come from illness or perhaps the will of the gods. Unable to understand the trick, they slowly walked away, leaving their enormous neighbor alone. It is one of the most famous moments in all of literature. Not because of violence, but because language itself became a weapon. Odysseus had defeated brute strength with careful thought. Yet the hardest part still remained. The cave was still sealed. At dawn, Polyphemus rolled the great stone away to let his sheep out to pasture. Blinded now, he sat beside the entrance, stretching out his hands to feel the back of every animal that passed. No man, he believed, could escape without being discovered. Once again, Odysseus found another solution. He tied his companions beneath the bellies of the largest rams using woven wool. Hidden underneath the thick fleece, each man clung silently as the animals walked toward the entrance. The giant's hands passed gently across every sheep's back. But he never thought to search underneath. One by one the Greeks slipped safely outside. Odysseus himself chose the largest ram of all, holding tightly beneath its wool until he too reached freedom. Only after the flock had moved well away from the cave did the men finally untie themselves. For the first time since entering the island, they stood beneath the open sky. The sea lay before them. Their ship still waited where they had left it. They hurried aboard and pushed away from shore with desperate strength. At last, they were free. For a while, it seemed the nightmare had ended. The wounded Cyclops stood helplessly upon the shore, roaring with rage as the Greek ship grew smaller across the water. The sensible choice would have been silence. The sea already carried them toward safety. There was nothing more to gain. But human beings are complicated. Even the wisest among us sometimes long to be recognized. Odysseus could not resist. From the deck of his ship, he shouted back toward the shore, mocking the defeated giant. His companions begged him to stop. They knew nothing good could come from provoking a monster who could no longer reach them. Polyphemus tore an enormous boulder from the mountainside and hurled it toward the sound of Odysseus' voice. The stone crashed into the sea so close to the ship that the waves nearly carried it back toward shore. Still Odysseus could not remain silent. This time he revealed his true identity. "If anyone asks who blinded you," he called across the water, "tell them it was Odysseus, son of Laertes, king of Ithaca." It was a moment of pride. Perhaps understandable. Certainly human. And yet history, and myth, often turns upon moments exactly like this. The blinded Cyclops lifted his face toward the heavens. Then he prayed. Not to an ordinary god, but to his father, Poseidon, Lord of the sea. "Hear me," Polyphemus cried. "If I truly am your son, let Odysseus never reach his home. But if fate has already decided that he must return, let him come late, alone, after losing all his companions, and let him find sorrow waiting in his own house." The waves carried those words out across the open sea. Whether the curse itself changed fate or merely expressed what destiny already held remains one of the great mysteries of the epic. But from that moment onward, every storm seemed darker. Every voyage became harder. The sea itself had become an enemy. And Odysseus, despite all his wisdom, had learned a painful lesson. A clever plan can save a life. A single boast can change it forever. Ahead lay the floating island of Aeolus, keeper of the winds, where a gift meant to speed the journey home would instead become another heartbreaking reminder that sometimes the greatest dangers do not come from enemies. They come from distrust among friends. The sea, for a brief and precious time, became gentle again. After escaping the island of the Cyclops, Odysseus and his surviving companions sailed onward beneath wide blue skies. The sails filled with a steady breeze, and the waves rolled softly beneath the hulls of their dark ships. No giant pursued them. No storm darkened the horizon. The cries of Polyphemus faded behind them until they were swallowed by the endless sound of the sea. Yet although the island disappeared from view, the consequences of what had happened there did not. Some decisions follow us long after the moment has passed. Odysseus could not know whether Poseidon had heard his son's desperate prayer. The sea gave no answer. It rarely does. It simply continued stretching toward the horizon, beautiful, mysterious, and indifferent. Days later, another island appeared. Unlike the lonely wilderness of the Cyclops, this land seemed strangely orderly. High cliffs surrounded it like natural walls, while peaceful harbors welcomed arriving ships. Smoke drifted lazily upward from distant homes, and the winds themselves seemed calmer here, as though they obeyed unseen commands. This was the island of Aeolia. Its ruler was Aeolus, the keeper of the winds. Whether Homer imagined Aeolus as a mortal king favored by the gods or as a divine being himself has long been debated by scholars. Ancient traditions describe him as the guardian of the world's winds, entrusted by Zeus with the power to release or restrain them whenever the balance of nature required. To sailors, no gift could have been greater. Odysseus and his men were welcomed with remarkable generosity. For an entire month, they remained as honored guests. The halls of Aeolus echoed with conversation. Meals were shared beside glowing fires. Stories of the Trojan War filled the evenings. Like many rulers of the ancient world, Aeolus listened with fascination as Odysseus described distant cities, famous battles, heroic kings, and the long road that still separated him from home. Hospitality was one of the oldest and most sacred customs in Greek culture. A stranger was never simply a stranger. He might be a future ally. He might carry important news. Or, according to ancient belief, he might even be a god traveling in disguise. When the time finally came to depart, Aeolus decided to offer Odysseus an extraordinary gift. He gathered every wild and troublesome wind that might blow the fleet off course and sealed them inside a great leather bag. Only one wind remained free. The gentle west wind. It would carry the ship safely toward Ithaca. The gift seemed almost miraculous. Odysseus carefully tied the bag shut with a shining silver cord and placed it deep inside his ship. None of the sailors knew exactly what it contained. They only understood that their king guarded it with unusual care. The voyage home began once more. For 9 peaceful days and nights, the west wind pushed the fleet steadily across the sea. The familiar stars slowly returned to their proper places. Islands that had once belonged only to memory began to appear again upon the horizon. Hope, after so many hardships, quietly returned. The men spoke excitedly of home. Some imagined embracing their wives. Others wondered how much their children had grown. One sailor dreamed of walking through vineyards planted by his father. Another longed simply to sleep beneath his own roof instead of the open sky. Even Odysseus allowed himself to believe the journey was nearly over. Then, at last, Ithaca appeared. Its distant mountains rose faintly above the morning mist. The island was close enough for Odysseus to recognize its familiar shape. Home. After 20 years away, 10 years at war and nearly 10 years wandering, it was finally within sight. Exhausted beyond words, Odysseus relaxed for the first time in many days. He fell asleep. It was a deeply human moment. Even the strongest leaders cannot remain watchful forever. But while their king slept, another feeling began spreading among the crew. Suspicion. The sailors had watched Odysseus protect the mysterious leather bag throughout the voyage. They had seen the silver cord and noticed how carefully he kept it hidden. Whispers passed quietly from one man to another. What if it contains treasure? Perhaps Aeolus rewarded only Odysseus. Why should one man keep all the gold for himself? Years of hardship had already weakened trust. Fear, hunger, exhaustion, and grief often change the way people think. When people have suffered long enough, even friends may begin doubting one another. Finally, curiosity overcame wisdom. While Odysseus continued sleeping peacefully, several sailors untied the silver cord. The bag opened. Instantly, every imprisoned wind burst free. The calm sea exploded into chaos. Roaring gales screamed across the water. Waves rose like mountains. The ship spun helplessly as though they were leaves caught in a storm. Sails snapped violently. Oars shattered. Rain and sea spray filled the air until sky and ocean became almost impossible to distinguish. The fleet, which had been only moments from home, was hurled backward across the Mediterranean. Days of careful sailing vanished in a single afternoon. When the storm finally ended, Ithaca had disappeared. The ships drifted once more toward the distant island of Aeolus. Imagine the silence that must have followed. No one needed to ask what had happened. Every sailor understood. Home had been close enough to see. And now it was gone. The tragedy feels surprisingly modern. Again and again throughout history, great opportunities have been lost not because enemies proved stronger, but because trust broke apart at exactly the wrong moment. Odysseus returned to Aeolus with quiet humility. Perhaps the Keeper of the Winds would show mercy once more. Perhaps another chance remained. At first, Aeolus listened. Then his expression changed. He refused. According to Homer's account, Aeolus concluded that a man pursued by such extraordinary misfortune must surely have earned the hatred of the gods themselves. To interfere again would be dangerous. His decision may seem harsh to modern readers, but it reflected an ancient worldview. The Greeks often believed that repeated disasters revealed divine judgment. Whether that judgment was deserved or not mattered less than the fear of opposing the will of Olympus. And so Odysseus left empty-handed. No magical wind. No second gift. Only the open sea waiting once again. The journey grew darker. For 6 more days the fleet struggled onward until another coastline appeared. This land looked prosperous. A magnificent harbor stretched inland between towering cliffs. Green forests covered the surrounding hills, while smoke curled upward from distant homes. Everything suggested safety. But appearances have deceived Odysseus before. Most of the Greek captains eagerly sailed into the sheltered harbor, where the water was so calm that the ships floated almost without movement. Odysseus hesitated. Perhaps years of wandering had made him cautious. Perhaps instinct quietly warned him. Instead of entering the narrow harbor, he anchored his own ship outside, fastening it to rocks along the coast. It was a small decision. History often remembers such moments only afterward. 3 scouts were sent inland. They followed a road leading through forests until they encountered a young girl drawing water from a spring. She seemed ordinary enough. When asked about the local ruler, she politely directed them toward the royal palace. The scouts thanked her and continued onward. Inside the palace they found not a welcoming queen, but a giant. The girl's mother was no ordinary woman. She was enormous. Before the horrified Greeks could react, she seized one of the scouts as though he were a child. The remaining 2 fled in terror. Their desperate footsteps echoed through the streets. Then the entire city awoke. The inhabitants were the Laestrygonians. A race of giants. Unlike the solitary Cyclops, these creatures lived together in an organized society. And unlike Polyphemus, they did not hesitate to hunt together. They rushed toward the harbor carrying boulders larger than wagons. From the cliffs above, they rained destruction upon the trapped fleet. The narrow entrance that had seemed so welcoming suddenly became a deadly cage. Ships smashed against one another. Wood splintered. Masts collapsed. Men shouted desperately as enormous stones crashed through decks and hulls alike. Those who leaped into the water found no safety there. The giants speared them as fishermen might spear fish. It was one of the darkest moments in the entire Odyssey. Not because of a duel between famous heroes, but because ordinary sailors, who had already survived Troy, disappeared almost without warning. From outside the harbor, Odysseus watched the catastrophe unfold. His own ship remained the only one with a clear path to the open sea. Without hesitation, he ordered every man to row with all his strength. The oars bit deeply into the water. Slowly. Then faster. The lone surviving ship escaped into the open sea. Behind them, the harbor that had promised shelter became a silent graveyard. Of the great fleet that had left Troy, almost nothing remained. Only one ship now carried the King of Ithaca. Only one crew continued the impossible journey home. The loss changed everything. The cheerful confidence that had once filled the expedition was gone forever. Every man aboard understood that the world had become far larger, stranger, and more dangerous than they had ever imagined. And somewhere beyond the next horizon waited an island covered with deep forests, where smoke rose gently above a lonely house. There lived a woman whose name would become one of the most famous in all mythology. Circe. To some, she was a monster. To others, a lonely goddess. To Odysseus, she would become something far more complicated. And this is where the story begins to ask not only whether a man can survive the dangers of the world, but whether he can survive the hidden weaknesses within himself. The sea felt quieter now. Not because the world had become less dangerous, but because there were so few voices left to hear. Where once dozens of ships had crossed the waters together, laughing around evening fires and calling to one another across the waves, now only a single black ship remained. The fleet that had proudly departed from Troy had become a memory carried by one weary crew. For the men aboard Odysseus' ship, silence had taken on a new meaning. It was the silence left behind after too many friends had disappeared. Each empty place along the rowing benches reminded them of someone who would never again see the shores of Greece. Some had fallen before the walls of Troy. Others had died on unfamiliar beaches. Others had been lost to monsters no one had believed could exist. The sea seemed endless. And yet, despite everything they had endured, they continued to row. That, perhaps, is one of the quiet themes running beneath the entire Odyssey. Human beings often continue long after they believe they have reached the limits of their strength. Not because they are fearless, but because there is no other direction left to go. Several days later, another island emerged from the morning mist. Dense forests covered its hills, stretching almost to the water's edge. Tall trees swayed gently in the breeze, while birds circled above the canopy. From the shoreline, nothing appeared unusual. The island looked peaceful, untouched, almost inviting. But then the sailors noticed something. Thin columns of smoke rose through the trees. Someone lived there. Odysseus guided the ship into a sheltered bay where fresh water flowed from a nearby spring. After securing the vessel, he climbed a rocky hill to look across the landscape. From that high place, he could see forests spreading in every direction. In the distance, hidden among the trees, another trail of smoke drifted lazily upward. There was no obvious danger. No armies. No towering walls. Only quiet woods. Yet experience had taught him not to trust appearances. The crew gathered to discuss what should be done. Food was running low, and they needed to learn who ruled the island. Finally, Odysseus divided his remaining men into two groups. One group would stay behind to guard the ship. The other would explore. The leader of the exploring party was Eurylochus, one of Odysseus' most trusted companions. It would prove to be one of the wisest choices of the journey. Eurylochus led his men through the forest beneath shafts of golden sunlight filtering between the branches. Birds sang overhead. The air smelled of pine, wild herbs, and damp earth after morning dew. Then, deep within the woods, they found a remarkable house built of polished stone. Around it wandered wolves and lions. Yet something about them seemed strange. Instead of attacking, the animals calmly approached the visitors, wagging their tails almost like faithful dogs. To the exhausted sailors, the sight was unsettling. Wild beasts do not behave this way. Inside the house, a woman sat singing softly as she worked at a great loom. Her voice floated gently through the trees, beautiful enough to calm even anxious hearts. This was Circe. In Greek mythology, Circe was a powerful enchantress, the daughter of the sun god Helios according to many traditions. Ancient storytellers remembered her as a woman whose knowledge of herbs, magic, and transformation placed her somewhere between goddess and mortal. She welcomed the strangers warmly. Food appeared upon the table. Wine was poured generously. After weeks of fear and hardship, the sailors gladly accepted her hospitality. Only Eurylochus hesitated. For reasons even he could not fully explain, something felt wrong. He remained outside while his companions entered the hall. Then everything changed. Circe quietly mixed enchanted herbs into the wine. As soon as the sailors drank, she touched them lightly with her wand. In an instant, they were transformed. Their minds remained human. Their bodies became pigs. Homer's description is surprisingly thoughtful. The men did not lose their memories. they understood exactly what had happened. They simply found themselves trapped inside unfamiliar bodies, unable to speak, unable to explain, unable to return home. Circe calmly drove them into a pen where other enchanted animals already waited. Eurylochus watched in horror. Frozen with fear, he dared not enter the house. Instead, he turned and ran. Branches whipped against his face as he raced back through the forest toward the shore. When he finally reached the ship, breathless and trembling, he struggled even to describe what he had seen. His companions had vanished. A beautiful woman had become a sorceress. Men had become animals. For a moment, no one spoke. The story sounded impossible. Yet after everything they had already survived, impossibility no longer seemed impossible. Without hesitation, Odysseus prepared to leave for Circe's house. Eurylochus begged him not to go. "We have already lost too many men," he argued. "If you go, we may lose you as well." His fear was understandable. Throughout history, caution has often been mistaken for cowardice. But Homer presents Eurylochus differently. He was not unwilling to be brave. He simply believed that a leader's life was too valuable to risk. Odysseus listened. Then continued walking into the forest alone. Sometimes leadership requires stepping toward dangers that everyone else hopes to avoid. As he climbed the woodland path, another figure appeared unexpectedly. A young man stood waiting beside the trail. He was graceful, bright-eyed, and strangely calm. This was Hermes, messenger of the gods. Unlike Poseidon, who sought to make Odysseus' journey harder, Hermes arrived as an ally. The gods of Olympus rarely agreed with one another. Their rivalries often shaped the fate of mortals. Hermes warned Odysseus about Circe's magic. Then he handed him a mysterious plant. The herb was called moly. According to Homer, its roots were black while its flowers shone white as milk. The gods could gather it easily, though ordinary humans found it almost impossible to obtain. Whether moly represented a real medicinal plant or existed only in mythology remains uncertain. Historians and botanists have proposed many possibilities, but none can be confirmed. Within the story, however, its purpose is clear. It would protect Odysseus from enchantment. Hermes carefully explained what must happen. "When Circe offers you the wine," he said, "drink it without fear. The magic will not harm you. Then, when she strikes you with her wand, draw your sword." The advice sounded almost unbelievable. Confront a sorceress who had transformed warriors into animals? Yet Odysseus trusted the god. He continued onward until he reached Circe's palace. Just as before, she welcomed him kindly. She invited him inside. She prepared a magnificent feast. She offered rich wine in a finely crafted cup. Odysseus drank. Nothing happened. Surprised, Circe stepped forward and lightly touched him with her wand. "Now," she said, "join your companions among the pigs." Instead, Odysseus drew his bronze sword. The sorceress stepped back in astonishment. For the first time in many years, someone had resisted her magic. Ancient storytellers describe Circe's reaction not as anger, but as recognition. She immediately understood that this could only be the man Hermes had foretold. Her attitude changed completely. She lowered her wand. She invited Odysseus to sit beside her not as a prisoner, but as an honored guest. Then, keeping her promise, she restored every enchanted sailor to human form. Even more remarkably, Homer tells us that they emerged stronger, younger, and healthier than before. Their fear slowly gave way to relief. The crew embraced one another with tears in their eyes. Men who had believed they would never again speak now laughed together beneath the same roof. For a while, it seemed as though fortune had finally smiled upon Odysseus. Circe welcomed the Greeks into her halls. Warm beds replaced hard ship decks. Fresh bread replaced dwindling supplies. The halls echoed with music rather than cries of battle. Days became weeks. Weeks quietly became months. According to the Odyssey, an entire year passed on Circe's island. It is easy to wonder why. Why would a man who longed so desperately for home remain away for another year? Perhaps because even heroes grow tired. After 20 years of war and wandering, perhaps the comfort of safety became difficult to leave behind. Perhaps grief demanded time. Perhaps healing cannot always be rushed. History often celebrates movement. But human life also contains seasons of rest. Eventually, however, Odysseus' companions approached him with gentle honesty. "Have you forgotten your home?" The question struck deeply. No. He had not forgotten. He had simply stopped counting the days. Circe understood. Unlike many of the dangers Odysseus had faced, she did not try to imprison him. Instead, she revealed the next stage of his journey. And her words were unlike anything he expected. "If you wish to reach Ithaca," she said quietly, "you must first travel somewhere no living man willingly goes. Not another island. Not another kingdom. But the land of the dead itself. There, among the shades of those who had passed from life, Odysseus would seek the prophet Tiresias. Only he could reveal the road that still lay ahead. The sea had already carried Odysseus farther than any Greek imagined possible. Now, it would carry him beyond the edge of the living world itself. And as the ship prepared to leave Circe's peaceful island, every sailor understood that the next voyage would not simply cross another stretch of water. It would cross the boundary between life and death. The morning they left Circe's island felt different from every departure that had come before. There were no cheers as the sail was raised. No hopeful conversations about how many days remained before Ithaca might appear on the horizon. The crew worked quietly, almost reverently, as though they sensed they were sailing toward a place where ordinary words no longer belonged. Circe herself stood upon the shore, watching until the ship became a dark shape against the glittering sea. She had provided everything they would need: fresh food, water, and careful instructions. Yet her most important gift was not something that could be stored aboard a ship. It was knowledge. In the world of ancient Greek myth, knowledge often mattered more than strength. A warrior might defeat an enemy with a sword, but only wisdom could reveal which road should be taken before the battle even began. Circe had warned Odysseus that his next destination could not be reached by courage alone. He would have to descend to the realm of the dead. To modern ears, this sounds like the beginning of a nightmare. To the ancient Greeks, however, the underworld was not simply a place of punishment. Most souls, whether kings or shepherds, heroes or merchants, eventually arrived there. It was a shadowed kingdom ruled by Hades and Persephone, where the dead existed as pale echoes of the people they had once been. Death, in Greek thought, was often less about torment than about absence. The absence of sunlight. The absence of warmth. The absence of life itself. Following Circe's instructions, the ship sailed beyond familiar waters,